Hi, my name is Ryan Langwish, and welcome back to Ludo Lodge, a channel about sparking growth for game designers. Today, I'm going to be continuing my series on prototyping in Tabletop Simulator, and specifically scripting in Tabletop Simulator, with an example on how to do a basic scripted card setup in Tabletop Simulator. So this is something like, at the beginning of the game, there's a button that the players can click, and it'll automatically set some of the things up as far as the cards going to proper places without you having to do it manually. Now, it's worth mentioning that depending on the game, this could look very different, right? Like, different games are going to have very different implementations of where things need to go, and I'm going to be doing this in kind of a abstracted, just tutorial setting. And so I'm going to have a specific kind of goal defined of how I'm going to do this and show it, with the understanding that there's a lot of variations that I could explain on maybe if this was a little bit different, you could do it this way. And there may be things that I decide are worth exploring more in a future video. But I think the best way for me to go about this is just to keep it kind of as to a concrete example as I can. So with that said, my goal here is, and let me actually pull in just a deck of cards here to use for my example. So I'm just going to have a standard deck of cards, and my goal is going to be to have a button, a setup button, that when clicked is going to deal cards to all of the players that are currently seated, so meaning they've selected their color, they're kind of in the game. So in this case, that's just me, because I don't have anybody else in this room right now. And then it's also going to deal cards from the deck into a row, kind of next to the deck, of face-up cards that are available during the game. This is something that many games implement something like this. And specifically, I'm going to have it deal a number of cards that's based on the number of players in the game. So for example, if I have 2 players, maybe it's going to do 4 cards, but 3 players, it would do 6 cards. So maybe it's 2 cards per player. And then I should expect that once it's done all that, that button should disappear, and then the players would have the opportunity to go forward in the game as if it, wasn't scripted at that point. So that's kind of my end goal that I'm shooting for, and hopefully I can break down here kind of how we're going to get there. Now, if you are completely new to this series and new to scripting in Tabletop Simulator, I highly recommend first watching my previous video, which was an introduction to scripting in Tabletop Simulator, especially if you don't have prior programming experience. I think it'll help just kind of get your mind around some of the basic concepts and kind of what we're talking about with this. So I think that's the best starting point, but hopefully this is a pretty easy kind of entry point as well, as far as a first example of something that you might want to do that is useful. So with that said, let's get into this. So I have this deck of cards here, and the first thing I'm going to need is I'm going to need a button, because I want a button that's going to trigger all this functionality. Now, something to know about the kind of UI buttons in Tabletop Simulator when you're using scripting is they always need to be either attached to an object, in which case they're going to be kind of relative to that particular component, or you can put them in the kind of global space, in which case it would be a button that looks very much like the buttons here, where no matter where you pan on the screen, the button kind of stays in the same place, which might be what you want. We could do that. In this instance, I'm going to explain it with the button being kind of in the game world on the table. And so to do that, the way that I'm going to kind of go about handling the fact that I need an object for this button to be attached to is I'm just going to use a checker. I'm just going to use a black checker. So I'm going to pull this out here. An important thing to understand with scripting, and I talked about this a little bit in my intro video, is when we make scripting changes, we're going to end up hitting the save and play button, which is going to kind of load in those scripting changes, but it's going to apply it to our last save file, and if that means that we didn't save since adding components like this, they're just going to disappear. So before I go any further, since these are kind of the pieces I'm going to want my button to kind of appear right here, I'm going to want this, I'm going to save this into a save file. So I'm going to go, and I'm just going to actually create a new save file here. So I'm going to save game and name it scripted, haven't thought about this ahead of time, scripted card setup tutorial. Sure. We'll save it as that. So now if we load that, it's exactly where we were before. So now every time we apply scripting changes, this is kind of where the last state will be. If I make any changes to this, I would want to overwrite that save file. Now we want to go to this checker and we want to right click it. And actually the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a name. And I'm going to name it set up cards button, because that's ultimately what this object is representing, is that button. The only reason I'm doing that is so that when I go into the scripting editor here, it makes it a little nicer for the tab to be labeled that way. In this tutorial, it's going to be pretty trivial because like this is all I'm going to have. But if you had more things that were scripted, you can see where it would be very helpful to have that name as opposed to black checker, you know, if I had multiple buttons or something like that. So I want to add a UI button here, which I'm going to do using the UI tab for our setup cards button. And so what I'm going to do here is add in a button is going to have kind of these XML tags that look something like this. That's going to be kind of our button. And any of the attributes that we want to give to this button are going to be inside of this first tag. And then in between the tags, we put the text of what we want the button to say. So for example, I can put in between here, set up cards. Maybe that's what I want the button to say. And then I'm going to have a variety of things that I want to define for this button, which I'm going to put on new lines here, which is really just a formatting preference, but I think it'll be easiest to read. So the first thing is anytime we have a button, we're typically going to be tying it to a Lua function that we're going to end up defining in this Lua tab, which is basically saying when this button is clicked, what code should we run? And so we define that by using the onClick attribute, which we're going to call this set up cards. So that's going to be our function that we define later to handle this functionality. Next, we're going to want to position this. So this position is going to be relative to our checker. So like I'm going to be passing it kind of an XYZ value. And if I put 0, 0, 0, it's just going to be right centered on my checker. I actually am going to use 0, 0, and I believe negative 30. That's basically just, I want to raise it on the Z-axis so that the button is completely above the checker. So in practice, the idea is that this will completely cover the checker, and most people playing the mod would actually never even know that that checker is there. But it fulfills the need of our button needing an object and also gives us a way to kind of easily move the button around if needed, which I'll show that a little bit later. So the next thing we're going to want here is to define just the dimensions. So let's go with a width of 600, and we're going to say a height of 200. And lastly, I'm going to define a font size. I'm going to have that be 72, which I just know from playing around with this earlier that that's going to be a decent font size for this size of button. So now, if we save and play here, we should reload, and we can see here that we have this button that currently is flipped upside down, and that's just because it's oriented however our checker is oriented. So you can see I can grab this checker here and the button's going to move with it. If I rotate it, it's going to rotate that button. Similarly, if I flip it, it's going to flip that button, which isn't really desirable behavior. So ultimately what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to get it where I think I want this to be, you know, so maybe just next to the deck here. And I could adjust this if I didn't want to do it grabbing manually. I could use the gizmo tool here to move. If I click here, I can get the actual numbers here that I could really tweak it exactly. I'm not too worried about getting this exact. So I'm going to get it where I want, and then I'm specifically going to lock the checker, which I could also do with the L key. Because now there's no, I'm not going to accidentally move it now. You can't grab the checker until that's unlocked. So it's a pretty safe way that this button's going to stay fixed where it needs to be. So we have this button now, set up cards. It looks really nice. And we can click it, but it doesn't do anything. And the reason it doesn't do anything, if we go back into our modding scripting here, is because we defined onClick to call the function setUpCards, but we didn't define a function called setUpCards. So we need to provide that function in the Lua code here for it to actually be able to call it. So let's do that now. We're going to do function setUpCards end. And so now this matches what I have here. And now when it's clicked, what do I want to have happen? Now, anytime you're programming something like this, you want to break it into kind of smaller subproblems. I don't want to try to program all of that functionality that I talked about at once. I want to kind of start with one piece and see, okay, does that piece work? Okay, once that's working, now I can build on it. So that it's just easier to debug and not have a bunch of errors kind of pile up on each other. So let's start by just very simply making it so that when I click this button, it shuffles the deck of cards. Because that's probably something we want in this setup, is when you set up the game, it shuffles them before actually dealing them out, so that we're not always getting the same cards every game. So we're going to need to access that deck, right? This is all through that checker button, but we need to call shuffle, or randomize is the actual function, on this deck. And the way we're going to reference another object on the table is through its GUID. So if I come in here and I go to scripting, I can see its GUID here, and I can click it to copy it to the clipboard. And so if I come back to my modding, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put that in my global code here. So I'm actually just going to delete what's here, and I'm going to say deck GUID equal to, and then I'm going to paste that in there. Now, why am I doing this in global? The reason is these GUIDs, this is never going to change for the deck. It's always going to be the same as long as I don't like delete and recreate that deck. However, I may be referencing this in a lot of different places in my code. Maybe not in this example, but if you were doing a full mod of a game, there might be a lot of different things that reference it. If I copy this string of text everywhere that I want to use it, if that ever changes because I replace the deck or for some reason the GUID changes, I would have to update that value in all those places. I'd have to find everywhere I used it and update it, which is a pain and prone to error. So the way I'm going to kind of approach things in general is I'm always going to define it in global here and kind of name it with this all uppercase style to kind of mark it as a constant, even though Lua doesn't really actually have the concept of constants in terms of this variable could change. Like if I chose to do deck GUID equal to banana, like that would change it and Lua is not going to complain about it. But it's more just a note to myself that I, as the programmer, don't intend this variable to change. I intend this to just stay the same. But you may be asking yourself, probably not, but maybe, we need to access that in here, right? We need that GUID in here. How are we going to get that information if it's in global? And Tabletop Simulator actually provides a function to grab variables from another one of your scripts or objects. So I'm going to actually do deck.gud equal to global.getVar, and then the name of the variable that I want to get. And this may seem a little silly, like why not just put this in here? But again, if this wasn't the only thing that was referencing this ID, I would have that ID now in multiple places, where now I can just always grab it from global, and if I ever need to update it, I should have one single point of truth that I can update it, and it should update it everywhere. So now that we have that in our checker, we want to get the actual deck object, which is a very common thing to want to do in scripting, and you're basically going to do that by using the get object from GUID function. And so we're going to use deck GUID, which we defined up here before our function. And so that should return us the deck object, and it should put us into this variable deck, which I made local simply because this is a variable that I only care about within the context of this function. It doesn't need to be accessed outside of this function. So now that I have this, the functionality I want at this point is I simply want to shuffle it. So all I need to do now that I have the deck object is called deck.randomize. And this is something that's just defined by the Tabletop Simulator scripting API as a function that a deck has. Like a deck, Tabletop Simulator knows what you are asking for when you say to randomize the deck. It's a tool at your disposal. So if I did this correctly, what should happen now is when you click the button, it should call setup cards, which should come in here. It should grab the deck object, and then it should call randomize on that deck. So if we save and play here, And actually, the reason our button is flipped back around is because that I need to rotate the checker. And if you remember, that's a change that I actually need to make to the mod itself. So I need to overwrite that here. Otherwise, when I do my scripting changes, it reverts back to the old positioning of the checker, which also means that this isn't locked anymore. So you can see this is a great example of how easy that mistake is to make changes like that and forget to overwrite it before. So it's just a habit you kind of have to build. Anytime you make those changes, make sure you save them to the main mod before you make more scripting changes. But if we see here, if we click this button, we can see that it did kind of the little shuffle animation, right? And if we look, we can see like 2 of hearts, and if I come back in and I save and play again, we should, if we click it, get a different one, right? So it's shuffling. So that's doing what we want. And that is the first step in what we want to do, right? When we click this button, we want it to randomize, and then ultimately we're going to want it to deal some cards out and deal some into a row. So let's go to that next step, which is to deal cards, which again, Tabletop Simulator makes it quite easy just by providing you that functionality in the scripting API. So a deck, besides being able to randomize, also has a function called deal. And specifically, in this case, we can just pass it the number of cards we want to deal. And there's other like attributes and options that you can pass to this deal function that are all documented in the API. But by default, if we don't provide any of those, what this is going to do is it's going to try to deal 5 cards to all seated players. Because that's kind of the most common case that you would want to do, is deal to all the players that are currently in the game. So that should be all we need to deal 5 cards to each player. Now, right now, I only have 1 player, and I don't really have a way to simulate being more than 1 player. But if we click this, we can see it shuffled, and then it dealt me 5 cards. So I have, 4, 5, 4 here. If we save and play again and do it again, I should get a different set, right? Because it's shuffling first. Now, the way we have it defined right now, this setup cards button is still here, and if I click it again, it's going to shuffle it again, and it's going to deal me 5 cards. And if I do it again, it's going to shuffle again and deal me 5 cards, right? Because that's all we've told it to do, is whenever you click this button, shuffle and deal 5 cards to all players. And if we had other players, it would be dealing 5 to every player. So eventually, we're going to want, after it does the setup, for this button to disappear. We don't want that to be an option anymore as they go into the game. But this is a good start, right? That gets us a little bit of the way of what we're wanting. So the last piece here is we want this, after it deals the cards, to deal some of them face up into kind of like a communal row to select from during the game based on the number of players. So I'm going to say 2 cards to the row per player. We'll kind of do that part second. We're going to start just with getting them to deal into a row. So let's come back into our modding folder. And let's go to our button. And it's all going to still be in the setup cards function, right? This is where everything needs to happen for us to be able to set up the game. That's the idea. So the way we're going to break this down is we basically want to find the position of the deck. So we want to know where is the deck on the table. And then we want to loop a certain amount of times, and each time through the loop, take a card, flip it, and add it to the row. And we're going to determine the position in the row based on that position of the deck, because it's going to be kind of relative to the deck. So the first step of that is we just need to get the position of the deck. So if we do local, and I'm going to name it deck, and this is, do I name it deck this or this? There's kind of the snake case versus camel case. From what I can tell, Lua doesn't have like a specific style guide preference for this. I may go with camel case just because it's probably a better chance that I'm going to stay consistent with it. But again, you can name variables whatever you want. It's kind of, as long as you stay consistent, it's going to read well and be clean. So to get this, it's going to be, again, a function on deck. But here it's actually going to be a function that's just on any object, which a deck happens to be an object, which is get position. And so what this is going to now return and store into deck position here is basically the XYZ value of the deck's position. So next here, I'm going to define a variable called x position, and I'm specifically wanting this to be taking the x value of our deck and kind of like incrementing it to the side, because when it deals the cards, I want to deal them to the side of the deck. So to get the x value of this position, this holds 3 values, an x, y, z, and so I can access those by using square brackets, and 1 here is going to just give me the first value, 2 is the second value, 3 is the third value. Now, if you have programming experience, that might sound off to you because most programming languages index from 0. It would normally be 0, 1, 2. But here with Lua, from my limited experience in Lua, it seems to index from 1, and that's also true when we see the for loop here in a second. So we're going to grab that x value, which is going to be some numeric value of kind of where is the deck on the table in the horizontal axis. And then we're going to add a value to that, which I'm going to do 3 only because I know that that's going to kind of put this where we want it to be. So the idea is that that x value now is going to be right next to our deck. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a loop where every time through the loop, we're going to draw a new card and flip it into place, and we're going to use this position to determine where to put it. And then we're going to increment this position by another 3 so that we bump over to another spot. So as the loop goes, it's going to keep, putting a card down, bumping to the side, putting a card down, bumping to the side. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So a for loop in Lua is going to look something like this. I'm going to say for I equal to 1, whatever you want the index to start with, and then whatever you want the index to go to. In this case, I'm just going to do 5. Eventually, we're going to want this to be based on the number of seated players, but I'm just going to use 5 for now. So 5, then we're going to do whatever's in this block. And so the block is going to have an end here as well. And so if you're not familiar with for loops, all this is going to do is whatever code is here is going to get repeated 5 times. And the first time through, the variable I is going to be equal to 1. Then I is going to be 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it's going to finish and go to our next code. So each time through, we want to get the next card off the deck. We want to flip it over to what our current X position is defined as. So to do that, we are going to use the takeObject function. So takeObject, again, is defined by the scripting API to be used on anything that's like a container, so like a deck or a bag. And it's basically a way to take an element out of that container and then bring it into the world, into the physical play space. And takeObject accepts as its kind of parameters to this function a Lua table, which is the curly braces. And a table, if you don't remember, is simply like a list of kind of a key value pairs. So it's just allows a flexible amount of variables to be passed to this function. So there's a lot of different things that could be passed to this function that are all documented in the API. Here we're only interested in a couple of specific ones, and that's going to be flip and position. Flip is what's going to tell it, hey, when we take this object from the deck, we actually want to flip the card so we can see it. And then the position is going to be where do we want to put the card on the table. So first, let's set flip, and we're going to set that equal to true, because we want it to flip. And then we're going to set our position, which our position here is going to be actually another Lua table, where we're defining 3 values, the X, the Y, and the Z value, right? So it's going to be like X, or rather, this isn't a Lua table. It's kind of like an array or a list. And so I need an X, Y, and Z. Now, what do we want those to be? Well, in this case, the Y and Z are going to be the same as our deck, right? Because we don't want the cards to go vertically different, and we don't want them to go into the table or above the table. So we can actually use our values from deck position and just use deck position 2 and deck position 3. Okay, so same Y as the deck, same Z as the deck, but we do want the X to be different because we don't want to flip it right on top of the deck. And here is where we're going to use X position, which we've already defined to be the deck's X position plus 3. So that should have this position be 3 units to the right. Once we've done that, we then want to increment x position. So now x position should be x position plus 3. So that the next time it loops, now it'll be, you know, the deck plus 6. And then the next time through, it'll be the deck plus 9. So that we get this nice row that kind of can go indefinitely regardless of how many times the loop is going to execute. So with this, we should expect that we should get some cards dealt to the table, and specifically 5 cards dealt to the table next to it. So let's test it and see if it works. So I'm going to hit save and play, which is going to go back to our last load file. And then we're going to click here. It's going to randomize and deal me cards and then should flip some. And it looks like it worked. So you can see here's our 5 cards here. And this is the first one through the loop, then second, third, fourth, fifth. And it dealt them into a nice row here. So that's cool, right? And like you can start to see where this would be useful if you were at the beginning of a game instead of having to like manually draw them and set them out there. So that gets us pretty close, but I mentioned that we want this to be based on the number of players, which is really going to be a minor adjustment to our script. Because really the number that's wrong here is this 5, right? We're saying always do 5, but that's no longer true. Now it's going to be a variable amount. It could be 4 if we only have 2 players, and it could be 8 if we have 4 players. So we want it to be how many players there are times 2, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this 5 with an expression that's going to evaluate to whatever number we want it to be. And I want that to be 2 times the number of players that are seated specifically. So Tabletop Simulator provides a function called getSeatedPlayers, which basically returns a list of all of the players that are seated currently. We don't want that list, though. We want like the size of it, the length of it, how many players are there. And this is where Lua kind of has some syntactic sugar to make it easy to do this, which is that the little hashtag, octothorpe, #, whatever you want to call it, if you stick that in front of a collection like what is returned by getSeatedPlayers, it's going to give you the length of that, how many there are in it. So now this expression is saying 2 times the number of seated players, which in theory should be what we want. So let's see if that worked. So because I'm the only player, I should expect it to only deal 2 cards out. And it looks like it did, aces. Now, because I can't bring in another player by myself here, I can't show that it's working with more. You could certainly test that in other ways. But I have pretty high confidence that that's working and would work with more because it's using that getSeatedPlayers function. And so the last piece that we're going to want here is we actually want that button after you've clicked it and it's, you know, done the setup to disappear. Its job is finished. We can get rid of it. And the way we're going to do that is just by destroying this checker object that's holding the button. And the Tabletop Simulator scripting API provides us with a destroy object function, which takes an object. So like if we wanted to destroy the deck, we could pass deck here and it would destroy the deck. In this case, we want to destroy the checker, which because we're in the checker script, this checker black right here, and actually this is reminding me that I lost my nicer name. I named it to the name of the button way back, but because I didn't save my changes before going to the scripting changes, I lost that change. So with checker black, because I'm in this script, there's actually a keyword, self, that's always going to refer to the object of the script that I'm currently in. So I can use self to basically get this object instead of needing to like get it by its GUID. So if I save and play now and come here, I should expect this to be the final product, for it to randomize the deck, deal me some cards, deal all seated players cards, deal out 2 cards per player to the row, and then get rid of that button. So let's see how that works here. And there we have it. That looks to be what we set out to accomplish. So, a fairly simple example, but touches on some things that are pretty common with like wanting to do a scripted setup. And so hopefully this was an easier and kind of understandable example. If you have any questions, I try to kind of think of what questions people might have as I'm commentating on it along the way. But if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. I would love to answer them. If you have ideas for future videos of things you'd like to see scripted or variations of certain things. I'd love to get those ideas. If you enjoy this video, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. I'm going to definitely be putting out more videos similar to this one, and I will see you in the next video.